Another way of doing ecclesiology would be to talk about models. Now, there are a lot of models throughout church history. We could talk about a Wesleyan model, Augustinian model, Cyprian model, Anabaptist model. Those are all models of the church. What I'd like to really focus in on is Avery Dulles' model. Avery Dulles was a Catholic priest, Catholic theologian. You may have heard of Dulles International Airport. His father was a diplomat for the United States, and so the airport in Washington, D.C. was named after Avery Dulles' father. Dulles wrote a couple important books for understanding theology. One is Models of Revelation, and this one, where this information comes from, is called Models of the Church. And so he says that the church functions in several different ways, and he makes the case that all of them have their advantages. Some of them have more disadvantages than others. And we want to unpack his models that he presents in the next few slides together. Before we look at them individually, just give you a quick rundown here. These are the things that Dulles is going to lift up. The church as institution, as mystical communion, church as sacrament, church as herald, church as servant, and community of disciples. The first one is church as institution. This is probably the least favorite of anybody's. When you think of institution, you think of things you can touch, you can feel, you can point to and say, there it is. It's buildings, it's bricks, it's mortar, it's parking lots. The church's institution focuses on structure, on laws, and in government, organization, leadership. The purpose here is to preserve and teach true doctrine. In the Catholic side, which is where Dulles would be talking from, the purpose of the church as institution is to dispense grace and to maintain order. It's very much in vogue right now to kind of poo-poo church as institution. And in fact, I'm going to include a link to this week's material that I would encourage you to watch. Just watch the first 3 minutes. It's a very interesting video that someone put up. My hunch is what happened. Some young college students were given an assignment to check out emergent churches, and so they filmed themselves going there. And the House of Mercy, I think it's called. It's been so long since I've watched it, I don't remember. But about 3 minutes in, after the service, they get to talk to one of the leaders. And he's a hipster. He has the whole look and everything. So you're the pastor here. You're the leader, the head dude. Well, I'm not really the head dude, he says. We have a very decentralized kind of form of leadership here. I'm one of the pastors along with so-and-so and so-and-so. And, yeah, that's kind of the hipster cool way of talking about things, but let's be honest. If you have a building, you have institution. You don't have kind of a hierarchy of leadership. Well, who says you're the pastor then? Who says you're the one that gets to get up and talk? Why doesn't Joe Blow in the back of the building get up to speak? I mean, no, you're the leader. If you decided on the time of meeting, you have structure. So it's really kind of fun to talk. Len Sweet, a good guy, very wise man, talked about Aqua Church one time. We need to be fluid. We need to be responsive. We need to be able to flex and bend and all this. And I'm all for that. But let's not talk like we can exist without institution. It's an inevitability. The basics of group dynamics says that certain people are going to rise to power and authority and others will take steps back. All that kind of stuff that happens is institution. I think it's Eugene Peterson that said one time that where 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, there's bound to be a fight. It's just a part of what it is to be together. And you have to have institution. You can't not have institution. So it's really cool. It's real fun to kind of say institution, boo. But the reality is you have to have institution. You can't live your life without it. Now, I'm not completely defending institution, however. The purpose of institution is to be the skeleton of the living organism. And it's supposed to give strength and structure and ability to move to the thing that's supposed to be fluid and responsive and touchy-feely and all that stuff. Okay, so it's the skeleton. The problem that we see sometimes is when the the thing that's supposed to be there to support the fluid church ends up being so kind of overpowering that the church exists to serve it. As if somehow my body all of a sudden took on this approach where the entire existence of my body exists to keep my skeleton alive. Just my skeleton. My head doesn't matter as much, as my heart doesn't matter as much, my skeleton. So when the problems with institution isn't its existence, it's when we see it being out of place. So a church has to send X number of dollars to the denomination each year. Well, if they can afford it, they probably ought to be paying their fair share. I'm not against that at all. But if it gets to the point where the big structure can't ever have a layoff, can't ever have a downsizing, can't ever have anything else, and the little church is struggling only to, keep the institution going, that's when the problem is. Part of our problems in many of our congregations in America today, we're strapped with these buildings that are beautiful, and I love Christian architecture. I really do. I think it's wonderful. I think it tells a lot about theology. But we are so fascinated and struck with our buildings that we can't escape them. We in some ways become enslaved to our buildings. Congregations that if they sold their property would have actually money in the bank to go do some creative ministry. But you won't ever go rent the storefront that's available. We have this beautiful building that we've got to keep going. Why? Because my great-grandparents put their name on the cornerstone and were here when it was founded. I'm all for nostalgia, but it does get out of place. So, institution, you got to have it. It is a problem when it gets out of proportion, when the small organism exists only to serve the institution. That's when it's its biggest problem. The next one is the church as mystical communion. Now, this is not the way we as Protestants typically talk about it, but as soon as I tell you the language we use, you'll hear it. The idea behind mystical communion is somehow there is this spiritual, intangible connection between us and Christ our head. There is this mystical communion, this mystical thing that unites us between ourselves and our head. The emphasis here is on the community of believers united with God and with one another in the Spirit. The purpose of the mystical communion seeks to engage our hearts and stresses the importance of openness to new insights of the Lord. So the way we Protestants talk about this would be body of Christ. When we say body of Christ, Catholics are saying mystical communion, talking about the same reality. Somehow there's this connection with our head that we can't touch. You can't point to it and say, there it is, that's what it is. But it's there in some way. And so they talk about mystical communion. We talk about it typically as body. The next one is the church as sacrament. Now, especially if you're in a tradition that doesn't have sacraments, you need to kind of roll with me here for a minute. A sacrament is understood usually as an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. We'll unpack that later. We're going to actually talk about sacraments next week as we continue thinking about the church. So roll with me for a little bit. An outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. What Dulles is trying to say here is there has to be a middle ground between church building, structure, desks, offices, phone lines, something that you can touch, hardcore stuff, and church that's completely amorphous, totally spiritual, can't point to it, you can't actually say there it is, mystical communion. There's got to be a line between that. And he says there is, and he's calling it sacrament. And I like this language. And I'm in a tradition that doesn't have officially sacraments. We would call them ordinances. But I still like this idea. So a sacrament is an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. So this is the logic of this. It would be that Christ is the Father's sacrament to the church. Christ is the Father's outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace to the church. The church is Christ's sacrament to the world. So the tangibleness comes in the elements. So just like in communion, the outward part is the bread and the wine, the bread and the cup. That's the outward part, the part you can touch, i.e. institution, brick and mortar. But there's something else going on that's deeper and more profound than just what you can touch and taste and feel and smell. There's something else going on, mystical communion. So here we have the church, and Jesus comes, and he is the thing that you can touch. But what's going on really inside is this spiritual grace that he's come to bring from the Father. And we are the same way. We are this thing that the people can come and touch, but we really are there to symbolize, to be a vehicle of this grace of Christ to the world. And even if you don't like sacraments, even if you don't like that language, I think there's something to this, and I like the image of sacrament. The purpose here is to know who God is by Jesus' entrance into history, so that the church, although it's imperfectly, it still shows us what Jesus is like. Jesus is most fully known in history. So this model is a blend or a middle ground between church as institution and church as mystical communion. The next is church as herald. When you think of herald, you think of like this proclamation, right? So the focus here is all those who have heard and accepted the gospel. The mission of the church is to believe and to proclaim this saving word. The purpose is the mission. The church points away from its structure and its life except as they affect mission. The only thing that matters here is mission, the proclamation of the world. Each local church is a complete church. They're connected to all others only by mission. So think of denominations that would be like this. This would be very much like the Southern Baptist Convention. They're independent churches, but they're connected by their mission. What matters in the Herald Church is the proclamation of Christ. It is the preaching of the good news. The concern even might be we don't want to be doing works of righteousness. We don't want to be trying to get people to kind of work their way to salvation. So it's just a proclamation. There is even a downplay sometimes of what could be called, rightly or wrongly, a social gospel, the social dimension of the gospel. The Herald tends to emphasize just the preaching, the proclamation in some way of the gospel to those who haven't heard. The servant model would be just the opposite. The focus here is on the community placed in the world to respond to the practical problems and needs of those most neglected. Hunger, illness, poverty, violence, things like that. The life and teaching of Jesus, especially in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are emphasized. The connection with Jesus and others as they work together to help others. The mission here is to pour itself out as God's love, not to draw others into itself. In my own tradition, we work with a larger world relief agency. I'm not going to talk about its name, but there is a sense in that agency that we don't talk about the gospel because we don't want people to think that they have to say yes to Jesus in order to get what we're there to give them. So we're there to give food because there's been a disaster. They don't have to say yes to Jesus for us to love them and for them to get this. So we don't even proclaim because we would never want there to be mixed messages. We're not just proclaiming so that you say yes to us. We really genuinely do love you. And that's good and honorable. But you almost trip over yourself kind of keeping you don't want to ever be duplicitous and having wrong motives, so you never say a word. And the problem with the herald and servant models in and of themselves is what I said earlier about show and tell. The herald model is all tell the gospel. The servant model is all show the gospel. There's times, though, where you have to do both, and these models by themselves don't permit that. When the church functions as servant, this would be essentially a social gospel thing. Its purpose is simply or fundamentally to respond to the needs of the world. The other would be the purpose of the church is to save the lost spiritually. I think there has to be a third way here, and Dulles thinks so too. The community of disciples is the middle ground between servant and herald then. It was not in Dullas's initial edition of this book, and for that reason, some have suggested that it must be his favorite, that he came up with it and said this is. He never said that. I think it's more likely that he realized that there had to be a middle ground, that there has to be something more between this. And I do like sacrament. I do like community of disciples. So here the focus is on a community of people committed to following Jesus together. They embrace different values together. They commit to a different way of living. They balance worship, ritual, and fellowship with active mission. And that mission involves both a caring response to human suffering and the act of inviting others to place their trust in Jesus and his way of living. So hopefully you can hear in that this middle ground between servant and herald. And I do think there's something to that, and I think there's strength in this model that Dulles lifts up.